Jupiter in the seventh house in each zodiac sign. Well, Jupiter is basically the planet of positivity, and that's why it represents increase. And because it's about increasing things, it's about creating things, and that's why it has to do with reproduction and children. And because it's about reproduction and children, that's why it represents parenting. That's why it has to do with all kinds of parental figures like teachers, guides, and so forth. Now, because it has to do with teachers and guides, that's why it symbolizes wisdom. And as a result of that, that's why it has to do with philosophy and religion. And because it has to do with philosophy and religion, this is why Jupiter symbolizes ethics, and that's why it has to do with honesty and lawfulness. One other way of looking at the concept of positivity is optimism, and Jupiter indeed symbolizes trust or faith or optimism, generosity of opinion. Now, we're clear about Jupiter. Let's get clear about what the seventh house represents so we can understand Jupiter in the seventh house. The seventh house is the area of the sky in which the western horizon lies. What's special about the western horizon? The sunset. And what does the sunset mean? It means less visibility. So the seventh house symbolizes less visibility. This is why it has to do with the endings of things, including death, things becoming invisible. And it also has to do with destinations and travel. But the seventh house is much more famous for another thing about the sunset, which is that the I figure, the sun, the ego, disappears there, so other people become important. This is why the seventh house has its most popular trademark, which it represents partners, partnerships, marriage. Since it represents partners and marriage, it represents how we interact with other people and how we intercourse. And since it represents how we intercourse, it represents how well we exchange and do commerce. Now we're up to speed about what Jupiter itself represents and what the seventh house itself represents. Now we can put them together, Jupiter in the seventh house. To understand what Jupiter in the seventh house represents, just listen for where Jupiter's symbolism is harmonizing or contrasting directly with the seventh house's symbolism. For example, Jupiter has to do with parenting, and the seventh house has to do with marriage. So if Jupiter is in the seventh house, this symbolizes a good marriage and children, which is a bit jumping the gun to say. What it actually symbolizes is this person is attractive. Because they're attractive, the ramification is they attract a lot of mates. And because they attract a lot of mates, the opportunity to select the desirable one or the preferable one increases. So there's a higher likelihood of being able to select the mate of your choice when Jupiter is in the seventh house, because the root meaning of Jupiter in the seventh house is you're attractive. Here's a couple of famous people with Jupiter in the seventh house: Chaka Khan, Nat King Cole, Jim Morrison, Dirk Benedict, Ricky Martin, and Marilyn Monroe. And then there's also this guy, Charles Manson, who's also a very attractive personality. Now we'll look at all these charts in more detail in this video, but first let's look at another point about Jupiter in the seventh house. Jupiter has to do with trust, and the seventh house has to do with cooperation. So these two are very essential because we don't cooperate with people we don't trust. So when Jupiter is in the seventh house, we have a person who tends to engender trust or faith. In other words, we feel like we can relate with this person. We should relate with this person. We should do business with this person. We should intercourse with this person. So that's pretty much the same as being attractive, but it's a little bit more in a friendship realm, whereas the attractive thing is more in a romantic realm. So you could use any of the celebrities that we already put up on the screen as faces for this aspect of Jupiter in the seventh house, but look at these two: Oprah Winfrey and Pope Francis. Very relatable and faith engendering, trust engendering. Again, we'll look at their charts specifically in a second, but there's one more important fundamental thing about Jupiter in the 7th house I want to bring up. Jupiter represents growth, but the 7th house is about death or decline or invisibility. So when you have Jupiter in the 7th house, you get a person who is giving and growing towards some kind of invisible ending without hope of arriving at the goal. Or if it works out well, we can say without the need for their efforts to actually bear fruit, still they dedicate themselves to the chance that the effort may bear fruit. So we can call these people untiringly giving. You can look at someone like Oprah in that light, or especially someone like Pope Francis in that light. But here's 3 more people. Wilhelm Grimm, dedicated to collecting myths. Carlo Rubbia, dedicated to discovering things that barely exist. And also dedicated to a hopeless cause almost, which is climate change. And Cesar Chavez. So now I think we have a good clean overview of what Jupiter in the 7th house represents. It represents being attractive, trust-evoking, and hopelessly dedicated to a cause. But Jupiter could be in the 7th house in any one of 12 zodiac signs, and that is definitely going to make a difference. So let's turn our attention to that now, starting with Jupiter in Aries in the 7th house. Let's line up what we know about Jupiter in the 7th and Jupiter in Aries, and the fact that if Jupiter is in Aries in the 7th house, it must be the 3rd and 6th Lord, if you're using a whole sign house system, which I highly recommend. So if you look at that set of meanings, you can see hopelessly dedicated has a lot to do with the 3rd and the 6th Lord in the 7th house, which is very, very dedicated and very, very work-oriented. So when Jupiter is in Aries in the 7th house, let's say that this particular zodiac sign highlights that 3rd aspect of Jupiter in the 7th, which is to be very, very dedicated to something. And our example of this was Wilhelm Grimm. Why was he such a tireless worker? Well, it does help that he has his moon in Capricorn. It also does help that he has a domicile Saturn. Don't overlook the rest of the chart and how it might accent or downplay what you particularly have your eye on at the time. Now let's move on and take a look at Jupiter in Taurus in the 7th house. Well, Jupiter in the 7th is attractive, and Jupiter in Taurus is really attractive, and the 2nd and the 5th lords in the 7th house are really, really attractive. So this one really rings the bells for the potential of Jupiter in the 7th house to be really sexy. That really comes out if it's in Taurus in the 7th house. An example of this placement is Chaka Khan. Why so sexy? Well, her Jupiter in the 7th is also with the 7th Lord, and is also with Venus, who is also right next to Mars. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Gemini in the 7th house. What resonates between all these things? It seems to be a trust-evoking placement, doesn't it? Because that's inherent in Jupiter in the 7th, and it's also very inherent if the 1st and the 4th lords are in the 7th house, because that symbolizes being expressive or communicative. When Jupiter in Gemini on its own also represents being expressive and likable about how you express yourself. So the whole combination of Jupiter in the 7th and Gemini in a whole sign chart indicates a person who is likable and trustable in terms of how they communicate. We feel like we can talk to this person. We feel like we should talk to this person. So Oprah Winfrey is a perfect example. Why is she such a perfect example for this? Well, one of the really important things to notice is that her Jupiter and Mercury are exactly trine. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Cancer in the 7th house. Nothing really seems to link up Nothing about Jupiter in the 7th really links about the 3rd and the 12th lords being in the 7th, nor does any of that link with Jupiter in Cancer. Yet Jupiter in Cancer is exalted. So we know it should be good, but there's nothing specific coming from any of these other things, like the 7th house or the lordships or the zodiac sign. So what we do in this case is we just use Jupiter itself as the flavor, the main flavor adder to what we're going to interpret with Jupiter in the 7th house. So we're going to get things like this: people listen to this person. This person can guide other people. People want to hear this person's voice. They have a good voice. Nat King Cole, for example. So why does he, however, have such a good singing voice? Like literally people want to hear his voice. Of course, the basis for it, the foundation for it, is in this exalted Jupiter in the 7th. But in his case, it's even more significant that his second lord is exactly aspecting his second house. Meanwhile, the moon and Mars are exactly aspecting each other, and Mars is the 11th lord. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Leo in the 7th house. So in this case, it's the 2nd and the 11th lord in the 7th. And what matches up? Well, it's the attractive thing, really. Jupiter in the 7th is attractive. The 11th lord in the 7th is very attractive, and so is the 2nd lord in the 7th. And Jupiter in Leo is attractive in its sense of confidence. It's charismatic. So Jupiter, like Taurus, really highlights the sexiness of Jupiter in the 7th house. For example, Jim Morrison, another perfect example, really. Jim Morrison, however, wasn't very sexy for very long. And that is mostly due to Ketu. Also, from seeing Ketu on his ascendant, we can determine that he's not exactly a popular figure like mainstream. He's kind of countercultural or underground. But yet somehow his sex appeal was so strong that it elevated him up into mainstream level success. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Virgo in the 7th house. In this case, we're finding a resonance between Jupiter in the 7th being attractive and the 1st and the 10th lords in the 7th signifying popularity. So we can put Jupiter in Virgo in with Taurus and Leo as very attractive zodiac signs for Jupiter in the 7th, but it's not quite as sexual and it's not quite as overpowering. Our example for this placement is Dirk Benedict. He's got it going on more than just a generic out-of-the-box Jupiter in Virgo in the 7th, because he actually has a house exchange between the 1st and the 7th lords. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Libra in the 7th house. So what resonates here is that Jupiter in the 7th is trust-evoking. The 12th and the 9th lord in the 7th represents morality. And Jupiter in Libra represents democracy and fairness, justice. So Jupiter in Libra in the 7th house is focusing more on the trust-evoking potential of Jupiter in the 7th. In the sense that this person likes to be fair, and people can see that, and people like that. They're drawn to that because this person is fair. Carlo Rubbia is our example for this. He's a scientist who discovered some very infinitesimal particles and who's an ecological activist. So he has an exalted sun in his 1st house, with the sun as the 5th lord, and it's in the 1st house with the domicile 1st lord. So that's a magnificent intelligence Raja Yoga. And that is opposite to Jupiter. Jupiter with the moon is itself another magnificent Raja Yoga of the 4th and the 9th lords. Let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Scorpio in the 7th house. Well, Jupiter in Scorpio is very sexy, and the 8th and the 11th lords in the 7th house is extremely sexy. So Jupiter in the 7th, which is inherently attractive, really, really, really clicks right now with the sexiness potential. But there's another side to this picture, which is that Jupiter in the 7th is trust-evoking, but Jupiter in Scorpio is deceptive. So a perfect example for this is Charles Manson. But don't think that just if you have Jupiter and Scorpio in the 7th, that you're destined to become the next Charles Manson. What really is Manson's trademark, besides a lot of things in his chart, the real key trademark is the exact conjunction of his moon to Rahu. Now, Jupiter in Sagittarius, 7th house. The 7th and the 10th lords in the 7th house indicate a popular person or likable person. Jupiter in the 7th house facilitates that by being either attractive or likable, trustable. But neither of these is really clicking with anything about Jupiter in Sagittarius. So we can say that Jupiter in Sagittarius is pretty sexy, but it's not super duper. It's kind of like a Virgo. Whereas if we just move our focus from the attractiveness of Jupiter in the 7th to the trust-evoking quality of it, then it clicks with Jupiter in Sagittarius representing a teacher figure. Because we trust teachers. I mean, that's a prerequisite of being a student, is to trust. So more so than being attractive, Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 7th house indicates a trust-evoking person. Our example for this is Ricky Martin, who's more of a sexy person than a teachery person. But for Ricky Martin, it's because his first lord is in the 7th house and aspecting his ascendant. That's why he's very focused on intercourse with the people, popularity. Now Jupiter in Capricorn in the 7th house. What clicks here is that the 6th and the 9th lords in the 7th house indicate somebody that works morally, works legally. They work within the law or they work for the law. Jupiter in the 7th is trust-evoking, so that goes well together to be a moral person and to be trust-evoking. Jupiter in Capricorn, however, is distrusting. So the full picture is that a person with Jupiter in Capricorn in the 7th is quite trust-evoking. We trust their distrusting of others, or we trust how they choose to be different. Pope Francis, a very good example of this. So why is he so religious? It's not necessary that Jupiter in the Capricorn in the 7th house is going to be religious, but why is Pope Francis so religious? The big thing for him is the house exchange between his 9th and 7th. And this also alleviates the questions that you might have about Jupiter being debilitated in Capricorn in this particular chart. The other thing that's going on with him is that his 12th lord has joined this Jupiter, and Jupiter is the 9th lord. So the 9th and 12th lords together indicates spirituality, and that strongly aspects his ascendant, so it's prominent in his chart. Now Jupiter in Aquarius in the 7th house. Well, guess what? What resonates here is sexiness. The 5th and the 8th lords in the 7th house, very sexy. Jupiter in Aquarius, popular appeal. And Jupiter in 7th is attractive. So Jupiter in Aquarius goes up there with Jupiter in Scorpio, Leo, and Taurus as particularly attractive and sexy placements for Jupiter in the 7th house. Example, fine example, Marilyn Monroe. Why is she so sexy? One reason is that she's actually pretty beautiful. And you can see that by her first lord being in the 11th house in Gemini with Mercury. Another reason that she's so sexy is that her 12th and 8th lords are there in the 7th house. Jupiter is her 8th and is joining her 12th. And then also her Venus is in Aries. So her Venus is in a fire sign while her Mars is in Pisces, a water sign. Finally, let's talk about Jupiter in Pisces in the 7th house. What's resonating here is that the 4th and the 7th lords in the 7th house are dedicated. So that goes exactly with Jupiter being in the 7th house, where Jupiter is very giving, but the 7th house is disappearance or invisibility. Now, Jupiter in Pisces is very positive. That is very important in this context, because without that kind of positivity, you can't sustain that sort of dedication. So a very hopelessly dedicated person, a person dedicated to causes that other people don't care about, to things that people consider unchangeable. A perfect example for this is Cesar Chavez. What's very, very, very important in his chart also, and how he has a political slant to his hopeless cause, is that his sun is exalted. And what also makes him such like a moral person is that his 9th lord is in his 9th house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.